Hi, I'm Suze with Sage Leadership Strategies, and I'm your host today of Community Forum. And I have the great pleasure to have with me Jeremy Stein, who is the Executive Director of Connecticut Against Gun Violence. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you, Suze.
So great to have you on the show.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So the first thing I want to start out is, I know you're newly appointed to your role. Can you just give us a brief overview on your background and how you came to Connecticut Against Gun Violence?
Sure. I'm an attorney. I've been a litigator for 23 years. I started out my career in D.C. I was a prosecutor, and while I was in D.C., I prosecuted a lot of gun crimes. And one of the things that I wondered while I was prosecuting these crimes, it was always a puzzle to me that there were so many gun crimes, so many gun deaths in a place where you couldn't have a gun. And in fact, the law at the time was that no one in D.C. could own a gun.
Really? I didn't realize that.
So my career kind of progressed. I went from the prosecutor's office, and while I was there, I ran the juvenile drug court unit. I figured I would try to do something that involved a little more community policing, getting involved with the people in the community, and trying to directly affect people's lives rather than just trying to do it from the law enforcement side.
Right.
So from there, I realized that maybe I could do more good on the other side. I became a public defender in Baltimore.
That's a tough job, isn't it?
It's an extremely tough job. Some of the best attorneys that I've had the pleasure of serving with were in that office. A lot of these people are real true believers in the cause. They really care about people. They really care about the Constitution. And they want to make sure that people's constitutional rights are protected, no matter what they're accused of.
Because it is interesting in this country. I mean, technically you're innocent until proven guilty, but the minute somebody's charged with something, their reputation, perception gets changed anyway.
That's right. And
yeah.
I think a lot of times, you know, especially now with social media and the way everything is instantaneous, I think that people assume that someone has committed a crime as soon as that they hear about it on the news. As soon as someone is accused of it, they think someone actually did it. And I think that the importance of having good public defenders and good defense attorneys is that they make sure that those people are not being judged in the public court, but they're being judged by a real jury who are hearing all of the facts. They're hearing everything from the investigation that law enforcement had, but also, you know, in the media, usually the accused voice is not heard. So that is also an opportunity at trial where the person that's accused can tell their side of the story if they choose. So I went from the public defender's office, and then I started a career in the private sector. And then for 13 years, I was in the private sector doing litigation. Most recently, for the last 3 years, I managed a law firm. And then I just realized that, I mean, the reason why I became an attorney in the first place was to help people. I felt like when I went into the private sector, working for big law firms, that I was kind of getting away of helping the individual person. I was helping companies, but I wasn't really helping individual people, and I wanted to get back into that.
So you were sort of missing some of that personal connection, touch.
That's right.
Mission.
Exactly, a mission. Yeah. And so, you know, from a, I guess, I just felt like something was missing. I felt like I wasn't using all of my skills to, you know, to help people, to help the community, to help the world, and then I decided that I was going to go into the world of nonprofit, but which specifically.
So it's very different. I mean, you went from being a lawyer, public defender, to working for a private corporation. Now you're back in nonprofits.
Right.
Very different in terms of funding and how you operate. You're probably learning that now.
Oh yes, absolutely. I just right before here, I had a meeting with someone to sort of help me with that as well. But you know, I think a lot of the skills carry over. You know, attorneys. You know, there's no magic skill set that attorneys have. I think that people who are good attorneys, they're good advocates. They can inspire people. They can interpret the law. They're good at public speaking, and I think all of those skills, help to make a good executive director for a nonprofit organization. And I think with an organization like Connecticut Against Gun Violence, where I can help is that I've been in that world of gun violence, whether as a prosecutor or as a public defender, and I've seen the destruction that guns wreak upon our society. I've also understood the other side as well, the gun owner. I understand what it is about the allure of guns or why people might own them.
Because it's a complex issue, as we know, and there's strong feelings and opinions and points of view on both sides of this issue.
That's right. It is a very complicated issue, and I think, unfortunately, it has become almost like a tribal issue.
Yes.
Whereas you have the gun owners versus the non-gun owners, or you have the NRA versus the gun violence prevention organizations.
So I want to get into that a little bit, but what made you actually decide to take this on as the leader of this organization targeted to this particular cause?
Well,
at this time.
Sure. So my wife is from Sandy Hook. I was a first responder in Sandy Hook at the time of the shooting.
As a lawyer?
No, I was a volunteer for Newtown Underwater Search and Rescue. I was the captain of NUSAR, and I have a lot of friends that were involved in as first responders in the shooting. Actually, one of my friends was one of the first responders there. I spoke to a lot of law enforcement officers. It was very personal to us for a variety of reasons. My wife grew up around the corner from the school.
Did she go to Sandy Hook?
No, she didn't, but her mother used to teach there.
Okay.
The NUSAR station is right on the edge of the property, so we actually back up to the school. We're right next to where the firehouse is, where a lot of the media gathered and where the families gathered to try to find out whether their kids were alive or dead.
Yeah.
And I spoke to a lot of people that day. The horror that was described about what people saw, I mean, it's indescribable.
Yeah.
And I have a very good friend who was a prison guard, and had seen a lot in that job, and then had volunteered with both NUSAR and with the Sandy Hook Ambulance Corps, and he arrived on the scene, and what he saw that day, it was too much. I mean, it caused him to retire, and I think there were a lot of people like that. I saw a lot of law enforcement officers, and oftentimes we forgot, it affected the families, of course, but there were law enforcement officers that will never be the same as well.
Yeah, how do you really recover from that? And I know your wife, Yvonne, I know she's been very involved in active in the movement around this gun violence prevention. So obviously you've been working this in the last 5 years since this awful tragedy, and then this position surfaced. So how did it come that you actually landed in this role?
So I had been looking for nonprofit jobs, and I had also been looking for nonprofit jobs in the gun violence prevention movement. And
so you targeted it.
Yeah, and I think my predecessor Ron Pinciero had done this for 16 years, and I think the organization was looking, they were looking for someone that could sort of fill, his giant shoes, and I think that my skill set, as I described before, was a good fit for the organization. It just, it's one of these things. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, I think.
And so the organization's 16 years old, right?
It's older than that.
Is
it actually
How old
started in 1993. It started from a shooting that happened in Bridgeport, and the founders of the organization, they were concerned about this a teenager that was shot, and they wanted to do something about it. They thought at the time, they couldn't believe that this was happening in their city, and they wanted to do something about it. Now, fast forward to where we are now, and not a whole lot has happened on a national level, a lot has happened on the state level, but really most of the gun legislation has changed post Sandy Hook. And so a lot of the common sense gun laws that we have now, unfortunately, was a result of the horrific act that happened there.
So that's interesting. So when people talk about common sense gun laws, like what does that really mean? Like we should all know, but we don't know.
So I think it's important for me to point out that our organization it's Connecticut Against Gun Violence. We're not against guns. We're not here to repeal the Second Amendment. As a public defender, it was my job to defend the Constitution, was to actually represent people's rights and make sure that their constitutional rights were upheld. And this organization isn't here to try to repeal the Second Amendment. We're here to try to get laws in effect that are going to save lives.
So is that the mission of the organization?
The mission of the organization is to make sure that we have laws in place that will help to save lives. But also, we're here to educate the public as well. We're here to educate people about the laws that are already in place, and to make sure that people know that there are laws out there that are protecting them. One example is we have a law in place that would allow people, it's called different things. We tend to call it a risk warrant. It's called an extreme risk protective order in other states.
Extreme risk protection?
Extreme risk protective order. But here in Connecticut, we refer to it as a risk warrant or a gun violence protective order or something. The whole idea of the law is that if you know someone who is at risk to harm themselves or others, and they have guns in the house, you can notify your local law enforcement, and they can apply for an order with the court to go into that house and get the guns out so that that person cannot harm themselves or others.
So what you're talking about right here is very tricky in terms of, on the one hand, people have rights, they have privacy, their home. You can't really say they haven't done anything, but it's more, you're saying, around what people are observing in terms of their behavior, things they're saying, things they're doing. It's so tricky to know, like, you don't really know when's that person going to snap. Because if I had Jonathan Fast on the show once, and he's written a lot about, from Columbine and et cetera, and bullying, and it's tricky that he sort of said, like, how do you really know? You look back, and some of these you could not have predicted that person would have snapped and done this.
Right, but there's a lot of cases where there are predictors, and if you take the shooter in Newtown, there were certainly signs.
A lot of signs.
A lot of signs
that
this person was capable of doing what he did. Now, can anybody have predicted that he was going to do it in the manner he did it? Probably not. But there is a real question as to whether or not there should have been guns in that house. So so that's the thing. The law isn't there to say, okay, the police can come in and decide on their own to take the guns, or that the family member can decide on their own to take the guns. The law enforcement officer still has to apply to a neutral judge, and that judge will then decide which is more important, the person's rights, or does he pose a greater risk to himself and to others, and so it is warranted. And the thing is, it's not a permanent thing either.
Right.
7 days later, this person can then apply to the court and say, hey, look, I'm fine.
Give me my guns back.
Exactly.
So in other words, your average citizen could go down to the police station and say, I'm kind of concerned. This person's been saying and doing some stuff, and I'm a little concerned.
Right.
They would investigate. The judge would decide whether or not they get this protective order to then go take the guns.
Right.
And then they show up. If the judge says, yeah, there's probable cause here or reason to be concerned.
Right.
And we have to investigate. So then the policeman would show up. And
it's like any other order. It's like if they had a search warrant,
right,
or any other order from a court saying, I need to seize this evidence, or I need to seize this. It is a It's an order that the police can use to get the guns out of the home. And there is that weighing process. You know, it's the police do investigate first before they go, and they make sure that they have proper
it's a
evidence, like anything
process.
else.
It's a process.
It's like any other. It's like any other warrant.
It's not like they're going to jump and just run to somebody's house. So what is? So this is a very contentious issue, and as you said, people who are gun enthusiasts are concerned that their Second Amendment rights are going to be taken away. But the thing that I always wonder about, and I hear what you're saying, is that when that Constitution was originally written, I don't think they intended to have the average citizen be able to have access to, first of all, they didn't exist, these warfare type weapons where in a second you could decimate 50 people. I mean, it was like, wasn't it originally intended to be, they had their musket, and there was a, I mean, seriously, in context of what the history was, they had their musket, and it was to be able to take up arms to defend themselves because we had a volunteer army.
Right.
So it's like kind of like it was written in this cultural context and the historical context of the time. And so it's, on the one hand, it's like, let's not take it away, but on the other hand, let's look at what it was originally intended for. I mean, so what would you say to that? Well,
there's I don't disagree with what you're saying, and you know, there's a couple of things in there. The first thing is, I think it's really important to it's really important to look at the language itself. Okay, I think the people that wrote the Constitution were very conscious of how they wrote things back in the day. I think that they were very conscious on every word mattered in the document. If you look at a document like the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, every word seemed like it was carefully chosen. And when you look at the Second Amendment, the way that the Second Amendment starts, and no one likes to quote this part of it, but the Second Amendment starts by saying a well-regulated militia. That's how the Second Amendment starts, a well-regulated militia. And I don't think it's a mistake that that's the way that the Second Amendment started out, and it didn't start out by talking about the rights of an individual to own a gun. Now, there is a Supreme Court decision, the most recent one, which is the Heller decision, and in that decision, Justice Scalia, who was an originalist, he's going to look at what the original, what they originally thought that the Constitution should do or say. He's not going to take that piece of paper and then bring it into modern world. He's going to look at it as if he were looking at it fresh from the original crafters of the Constitution.
The original intent.
So exactly, and so there's no bringing it forward to modern days. He looks at it as it was originally intended.
Okay.
And when he did that in the Heller decision, what he said was that the Second Amendment does grant an individual a right to have a gun, but that right is paramount in the home. Also, what he says is that right, within that right, it gives the states the right to regulate that ability to own a gun. So it doesn't give, even that decision doesn't give someone unlimited access to guns, unlimited access to firepower.
So it's within certain criteria and boundaries. So I want to, so you're a few weeks in the job. What's been your biggest surprise so far?
Well, my first week in the job was the Las Vegas shooting, okay, where 58 people were killed.
It's a great way to get baptized, I'm sorry to say.
So that was and I was shadowing my predecessor at the time. I hadn't really taken over the job yet, but I was shadowing him and learning the job. And so that was the first week that I'd started with that organization, where 58 people were killed, the worst mass shooting in our country's history, where concert was turned into this war zone. So that was, that was a bit of a shock. I didn't think anything could get worse in this country as far as gun violence was concerned. And then the second week was the church shooting in Sutherland Springs. So the first 2 weeks were a bit much. And
overwhelming, to say the least.
Exactly. And I think that, so I figured that the federal government was going to do something about it, given these two events and also in the wake of Sandy Hook. But when you look at what the federal government did, the very first thing they passed, as far as gun violence prevention was concerned. The very first gun law that our federal legislators passed since the Las Vegas shooting was the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Law.
Which, that's very disturbing.
It is, and what's even more disturbing is that the day that they did that, all right, it happened to coincide with the National Vigil, which marked the 5th anniversary of the Sandy Hook shooting. So while all of these gun violence prevention leaders and advocates and survivors of Columbine and Sandy Hook and you name it,
very discouraging.
they were all down there to try to mark and to honor the 5th anniversary and to hold a vigil. And on that same day is when the House of Representatives passed a concealed carry reciprocity law.
Felt like a setback, to say the least. So where do you go? So as leading this organization to try to be, there's a lot of different organizations out there working on this, right? But your organization, where does that leave you?
Well, I mean, so when you have when you have the House of Representatives, there's a lot to do. Let's put it that way. There's a lot to do. So what with concealed carry reciprocity, I mean, it still hasn't passed the Senate, so it's not officially a law yet, right? So that's certainly a lot of work to do, because the importance of making sure that that doesn't pass is really important to the safety of everyone in our state and in our country. What concealed carry reciprocity would do is it would basically allow the state with the worst gun laws to have that person from that state come into our state that has the second strongest gun laws in the nation, and they would allow that person in that state to come into our state without having a background check.
Yeah.
To come in and to waltz into our state, armed and ready to go.
And Connecticut, like you said, Connecticut has been a leader in this and has done so much work to try to create more preventative measures for this, to try to prevent more violence from happening.
Correct.
And we have something like this. It's a curveball, to say the least.
Yeah. So I mean, what we have to do is we have to make sure that this doesn't pass. Okay, because the ironic thing is that to pass a law like this is to also do away with the state's ability to govern themselves.
Yeah.
And so the irony is that the same people who argue for states' rights are probably the same people that are voting to pass a reciprocity bill that would do away with all of the state's laws.
Yeah, so what can the average person do to, let's say, try and support? You said the work now is to try to ensure that this does not pass, because it takes power away from the states to self-regulate. And so we have like 5 more minutes, so I want to make sure that we get to some very specifics in terms of what the average person can do to support this.
So you can write your representatives, okay? Make sure you're vocal, make sure that they know you're there and what you believe in. But it's also, it's really also about the votes. So if we want to pass common sense gun laws, we have to have people in office that are going to pass common sense gun laws. And if those people that are in office aren't going to do that, then we need to put people in office that are. And so it's very important that we look at our representatives and make sure that they know what the community wants, because the average citizen, because the majority of gun owners want universal background checks.
That's what gets me, is I've seen different statistics. It's somewhere anywhere between 75 and 90% of gun owners want better gun laws.
Right.
But the NRA is a great lobbying force, as we know. So what statistics do you have, just in terms of, what's really been done, what progress has been made, and where we can make more progress?
Well, if you want to talk about statistics, all right? I want to talk about statistics in a different way, all right?
Okay.
I just want to talk about like the numbers. So right now in 2017, 61,000 people were involved in gun-related incidents. They were harmed or killed. 61,000. Out of that 61,000, 15,000 people in the United States were killed by guns. So think about that, 15,000 people. And then another number I want to point out to you is 3,235. That number is the number of teens that have been killed or injured in this country by guns. I mean, these are unbelievable numbers. Now, in Connecticut in 2017, there were 74 gun homicides. And then if you add suicides in, and I think suicides are really important. Now, the NRA has mentioned that suicides don't matter. And that is
How can you
ridiculous.
say suicides don't
Well,
matter?
that's what they said on their
understand.
NRA TV. They said suicides shouldn't matter, and then the numbers are skewed, that suicides shouldn't count in gun violence numbers, which I think is ridiculous. But if you add suicides into that number, there were 179 total deaths in Connecticut in 2017. Now, if we look at Sandy Hook, in 2011, pre-Sandy Hook, 2011, because we passed all of these common sense gun laws after Sandy Hook. So in 2011, there were 102 gun homicides, and with suicides, there are 217 gun deaths. So the difference after these laws were passed, so there was a 27% decrease in gun homicides after the Sandy Hook legislation. So what does that mean?
Yeah.
It means that common sense gun laws, that strong gun laws save lives. Connecticut has the second strongest gun laws in the country, and
Who's first?
it's California.
Okay.
And part of my job as executive director for CAGB is I want to be in that #1 spot, and I'm not going to do it in any way that's going to take away anyone's rights. But I want common sense gun laws that are going to save lives. I think we could have better safe storage laws in this country.
So basically, not to interrupt you, but basically
No.
you're saying, given your background as a public defender, and you believe in this country, you believe in the Constitution, and you've been a student and an advocate of constitutional and rights your whole career. And so you're approaching it from that perspective. How do we protect people, but also ensure people's rights are kept in place, but there's a space there for safety?
Exactly. And I think that ultimately we have to ask ourselves whether an individual's rights are more important than the society's rights. I mean, and I think it differs depending on what you're dealing with. But I think there is a point where we have to talk about society's rights as a whole versus my right to have a gun.
Yeah. You know what? We're at time. Can you believe it? I feel like we're just getting into the meat of it.
I agree.
Like that point right there, we could talk for another time. So maybe we'll have to have you on again.
I'd be happy to come back.
Okay. So if anybody wanted to get a hold of you or the organization,
Sure.
How would they do that?
So the best way is probably through our website. So it's www.cagv.org, and so that's cagv.org.